Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. The Nandi Bear is an alleged cryptid that dwells in East Africa. The very first mention of the Nandi Bear that I could find is from the beginning of the 20th century. It appears in the Journal of East Africa and Uganda Natural History Society, an edition from 1910. The publication contains everything from native customs in regards to fishing, hunting, and cultivation, a catalog of artifacts found at sites that predate recorded history, a list of creatures that should be avoided in no particular order of severity, and a relatively comprehensive directory of all the creatures living in that still remote place. In this publication from over a century ago, there is mention of a rash of sightings of a creature that remains uncatalogued to this day. It's called the Nandi Bear, or as the locals called it, Chemoist. The sightings were recorded in the journal by a British administrator named C.W. Hobley, who lived in Kenya at the time. Hobley writes that he was able to, quote, accumulate a considerable amount of evidence which all goes to show that some curious beast does exist. And the following are descriptions of the encounters that he compiled from that wild place, during that wild time. All of the locations mentioned seem to be focused within western Kenya, where the Great Rift Valley meets the water systems of Lake Victoria. Hobley writes that a British major who dwelled in western Kenya, then known as the Rift Valley in West Kenya, was alerted to an unidentified creature at dusk. The major rushed outside to see a, quote, strange creature rapidly fading into the landscape. He only saw it for a moment, but he describes it as possessing long hair, low to the ground, only 20 inches or knee-high, bulky in stature, and he said it had no tail. The major made a particular note of this, because only a few days earlier, some travelers from the Netherlands came through, and mentioned that they didn't know there were any bears in Africa. The major, of course, said there are no bears in Africa. But the travelers insisted that their dogs chased a small bear into some thick brush, and that the dogs returned soon afterwards, obviously repelled by their quarry. They said the, quote, bear was thick-set, and during its altercation with the dogs, it made a, quote, peculiar moaning cry. The year before that, an engineer working on the Magadi railway system states that he found tracks which he could not identify. The tracks followed a cart path that had been carved through the grass. He said the prints were rectangular, but curved inward along the middle on either side. He said it had 5 oblong toes, each with a short claw mark. The next encounter comes from a district commissioner, known only as N.E.F. Corbett. Corbett said he was walking downstream of his farm to go fishing when he stumbled upon the creature. He was on a ledge overhanging a river, and the creature was by the water. Apparently they surprised each other, and the creature ambled into the water, swam across the river, and passed directly into the thick brush on the opposite side. Corbett, not to be confused with naturalist Jim Corbett, writes, quote, I went a little downstream to fish, and to my surprise, I walked right into a beast. It was evidently drinking just below me a yard away. I only noticed it when I heard something shamble across the stream into the bush. The place was overgrown, and I was without my specs, so could not get a very good view, but I'm certain that it was a beast I have never seen before. It had thick reddish-brown hair, with a slight streak of white down the hindquarters, rather long from hock to foot, rather bigger than a hyena, with largish ears. I did not see the head properly. It did seem to be a rather heavily built animal. The annoying thing is that I had been past exactly the same place an hour before with my gun after a duck, and when I returned, had nothing but my fishing rod. I think it's worth noting that he was following a stream through some brush, some 8 years after and 200 miles away from a little place called Savo, and he only had a fishing pole. A railway engineer known as G.W. Hicks was traveling on a motor trolley traveling at 20 miles an hour when he saw what at first he thought was a hyena. He said he thought it was strange to see a hyena so late into the heat of the day, as typically they are creatures of dawn and dusk. But as the trolley brought him closer, the creature changed direction, giving view its broadside, and the engineer saw that it wasn't a hyena at all. He said it was close in height to a lion, though not as long, and much thicker, and unlike a lion, It had a short neck that sloped down. It had withers, or shoulder blades that rose high above the head and rear. It had a short, quote, pugged nose. He said its color was tawny. It had shaggy long hair and a mane like a lion. He said the feet were large and covered in black mud, as that afternoon had brought relief from a morning downpour. He said the front was markedly bigger than the rear. He said that as it dashed off, it moved both forelegs at the same time, and then both hind legs at the same time, much like a galloping rabbit. He said it had short but round ears, and it didn't have a tail. Hicks said that he had his 350 Rigby inside the trolley, but was traveling too fast to have retrieved it and gotten off a shot. He said that had it been any other day, he would have stopped the trolley and pursued it. But the rain of that wet season had washed out numerous rail tracks, so he was pressed for time. There was work to be done. He returned that evening, but it was raining again, and the grass now contained standing water, so there was no sense in attempting to track it. Hicks began inquiring to see if anyone else had viewed such a creature, and he found someone. The young son of a Dutch man said he saw the described creature earlier, but the boy hadn't thought anything of it, as all the creatures of Kenya were new to him, so he didn't realize that his sighting was anything out of the ordinary. Hicks said that the boy picked a picture of a bear from an illustrated kid's book, saying it shared a greater likeness than any description he could find in an official field guide, which is curious. Hicks also spoke with a native trader, who claimed to see the same thing on a walking path. He said the creature stood up on its hind legs and looked at the man before running off. Hicks was contacted by an Italian subcontractor who claimed to see an identical creature on the same trolley line about 29 miles before the location of Hicks's sighting. To be clear, Hobley recorded Hicks's sighting and the 3 sightings that Hicks recorded himself. Hobley writes that, quote, there is a certain variation, but that is to be expected, as he is obviously under the impression that there is an unclassified species as opposed to simply one creature. In fact, he said he heard tell that some time ago a bower shot and killed one of these creatures, and the story contained a very specific location, but Hobley could not find a body when he investigated the area himself some months later. But of course, that is to be expected, particularly in Africa. Hobley concludes by saying, my only hope is that it may fall into the hands of someone who will measure and photograph it and preserve its skin and skeleton for description by a qualified zoologist. And that statement kind of sums up why this particular cryptid case study is so intriguing. There's absolutely nothing in the sightings and stories that alleges that the creature is anything short of a mid to large size creature that is yet to be classified. This was almost 110 years ago, in a place that even today is still wild enough to support a high density of megafauna. What I mean to say is that, in that time and place, an uncategorized creature was not scoff-worthy. Rather, it was expected. I like how none of the reports are particularly dramatic. None of the encounters are fantastic exploits that would garner excessive attention or prestige. And none of the encounters really describe some kind of bloodthirsty threat to mankind. This creature sauntered off every time. Though I should note, if there is one place on the planet where creatures are not particularly known for peacefully sauntering off, it's Kenya. But of course, the notion of the Nandi Bear being a shy and fleeting creature quickly disappeared. A journal called The Lancet, from Princeton University Press, writes in 1914 that, quote, stories in regard to the animal do not agree except in this, that it is fairly large, stands on its hind legs, is nocturnal, very fierce, and kills men or animals. I could not find one account before that article's publication in 1914 that supports those claims, other than that it can stand on its hind legs and that it's fairly large. So how did it become nocturnal, very fierce, and something that kills men or animals? Because it's unknown. And there is no greater fear than the unknown. Of course, we assume the absolute worst from an unknown, and that's probably why we're not extinct. And as always seems to be the case, there's yet another take to consider. An English linguist and historian with the last name Huntingford writes in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland in 1927 about the chemoset. Chi, maybe shay, I'm not really sure, is a prefix meaning one who is doing an action, and mos means to strike, so I guess chemoset translates to the one that strikes. Huntingford also writes that the Nandi culture attributes chemoset to two separate beings. First is a devil, and yes, this seems to be the case. First is a devil with 9 butts and 1 leg, and it can be seen at a distance because its mouth is full of fire. I decided not to put my illustrator through the trauma of depicting that one. The second meaning of chemoset is more feasible. He writes that the Nandi agree that it is larger than the largest hyena, has long red hair, and leaves long-footed tracks. And he notes that there is a debate among the Nandi about whether it more resembles a hyena or a gorilla. But they agree that the victims of the chemoset are always found scalped, which I find curious, because if you've ever had the misfortune of seeing the survivor of a chimpanzee attack, you'll know that's what they do. Huntingford also writes about a British district officer named Mr. Cumberpatch, and this one comes from East Kenya, in a region known as the Tana River Delta. The district officer spoke with some German missionaries, who were on their way to a village inhabited by people of the Pocomo tradition. The German missionaries returned soon after, saying that when they reached their destination, they found it abandoned. Cumberpatch writes that he was skeptical of the German missionaries' story, and he thought they failed to find it. So he investigated himself and found that indeed the Pocomo settlement had in fact been abandoned, and the residents had fled to a larger settlement down the river. He traveled there and asked why they left, and they said that their settlement had been accosted by what they called the Kodoelo, or Kodoelo, which I'd be very surprised to learn that I said correctly. They described the Kodoelo as a giant baboon, man-sized if not larger. They said it walks on 4 legs, but can rear up on 2, just like a baboon. They described it as very fierce and brazen. The Pocomo people said that once it learns what it can get away with, it only escalates, which is 1, curiously descriptive, and 2, an appropriate description of primate behavior. Cumberpatch seemed to be impressed by this particular account, most obviously because inhabitants of that village truly abandoned their fertile settlement. And 2, he writes that the Pocomo culture, in particular, is not known for being, quote, overly imaginative or tightly strung. Cumberpatch, in 1911, wrote, quote, "It is possible that there is some undiscovered anthropoid beast in the dense bush found in the Tana Valley." To be clear, this tidbit on the Kodoelo is not historically associated with the Nandi Bear, but it is from a different part of the country with a distinct culture and language, so whether or not the sightings are related, it makes sense that the descriptions and verbiage would vary to some degree. As far as I can tell, everything I've mentioned thus far is the exigency of the Nandi Bear, at least the record of it, which seems confined between 1900 and 1925, and I think it's worth noting that the Europeans, which in this case were the people who wrote stuff down, had much greater concerns in this volatile place and wild time. The sightings of this creature in the Rift Valley region of Kenya largely followed the Magadi Railway, and many of the witnesses mentioned either worked for the railroad company or were bound to the railroad as a mode of transportation. I don't think the alleged creature was particularly interested in the railroad, perhaps as a corridor of travel, but more than likely, that's simply where people would have been present to see it. I particularly like the initial reports I summarized, because there really wasn't anything cryptozoological about them, so to speak, at least cryptozoological as the word is often used. More simply put, it was zoological. People were seeing a type of animal that had yet to be classified, and people were curious about it, but by no means hysterical. And the creature's description is certainly not overly dramatic or far-fetched. I guess I just mean to say that it is refreshing to research a subject that has absolutely no reason to assume hoax or lies. These people saw a creature that they couldn't identify. The creature witnessed following the Magadi Railway must be either a misidentified species of native animal, a species of non-native animal, an unknown species, or a species known from the fossil record that is thought to be extinct. Before taking a closer examination of these possibilities, I think it is worth summarizing the descriptions from the individual sightings. First was the Major. He described the creature he saw as, quote, possessing long hair, low to the ground, bulky in stature, only 20 inches off the ground, or about knee-high. The travelers whose dogs chased after the alleged creature described a, quote, thick-set, small bear that made peculiar moaning cries, which isn't terribly useful. I don't know if they mean a small bear as in a knee-high bear, or small for a bear. 100-pound bear is a small bear, but not exactly small. The district commissioner, N.E.F. Corbett, who saw it on his way to go fishing, describes the creature as possessing thick reddish-brown hair, with a slight streak of white down the hindquarters, rather long from hock to foot, rather bigger than a hyena, with largish ears. I did not see the head properly. It did seem to be a rather heavily built animal. He said that he was, quote, certain that it was a beast I have never seen before. The engineer named Hicks, who saw the creature from the rail trolley, seems to have had the best view. He saw it from the rear and broadside. He said it was the height of a lion, though not as long, but much thicker. It had a short neck that sloped down. Its shoulder blades rose high above the head and rear. It had a short pugged nose. It was tawny in color. It had shaggy long hair, like the mane of a lion, but all over. He said the feet were large. He said the rear was markedly bigger than the front. He said it moved its front legs at the same time, and then its back legs. It had short but round ears, and no tail. The young boy that Hicks spoke with said it looked like an illustration from a picture book, as opposed to any animals sketched in an African fauna field guide. There was the Kenyan trader, who saw it reared up on 2 legs, looking at him. So, what did they see? What are we looking at? First, we should look through potential misidentification of native species, because as Wikipedia so brazenly asserts, these people were seeing a honey badger. To be fair, the honey badger, or rattle, does look a bit like a little, thick-set bear. They are the 4th largest terrestrial mustelid, behind the wolverine, European badger, and hog badger. I say terrestrial because several species of otters are larger by far. But the sighting with the smallest description was that of the British Major. He said the creature he saw was knee-high, or 20 inches. A honey badger should be about 10 inches tall at the shoulder, about the height of an average house cat. So even the smallest alleged Nandi Bear was twice the height of a large honey badger. And though the rattle certainly is bulky relative to its size and low to the ground, it actually has rather short hair, and the Major saw it fleeing, so he certainly would have observed the tail, though it's certainly not unreasonable to suggest that a honey badger may have lost its tail in an altercation. As for the travelers who saw a thick-set small bear, sure, perhaps it could have been a rattle. It certainly fits that it could easily repel a group of dogs, but Corbett's sighting at the river was larger than a hyena, and Hicks's creature was the size of a lion. But forget the size. The overwhelming reason the described Nandi Bear can't be a result of honey badger sightings is simple notoriety. There are 10,000 adjectives you could use to describe these little devils, but cryptic is not one of them. Honey badgers are fierce. Their boldness is well represented in our knowledge about them. There are claims that even beating them with sticks is not enough to repel them from their meal. They are even known to steal food from lions, which is kind of a misleading statement. Lions would simply rather part with 8 pounds of their meal than risk losing their lion bits. Anyway, what I mean to say is that the lore and awareness behind the honey badger is and has been prolific. You don't get to Central Africa without being familiar with them. And based on description alone, aside from perhaps the Major and the travelers from the Netherlands, the honey badger cannot be responsible for the sightings of the Nandi Bear. Hobley, the anthropologist and historian who compiled some of these accounts, says that at first he thought people were simply seeing a, quote, common hairy ant bear, which he later calls Orycteropus, which is an aardvark. But then some of the sightings were too off base to be a common hairy ant bear, and some of the witnesses were far too familiar with common hairy ant bears to misidentify a common hairy ant bear. And whoever decided to call them aardvarks instead of a common hairy ant bear did the world a great injustice. Aardvarks are actually larger than you may think, but obviously their most striking feature is the pointed snout and pointed ears. It certainly doesn't possess a predatory appearance. It has a notable tail. The only feature that perhaps fits is that the hind legs are smaller than the front legs, which is indicative of a digger. But because not one description mentions a pointy nose or long pointy ears, and because every description mentions long shaggy hair, I don't think a common hairy ant bear is to blame for the sightings. The next culprit is the hyena. There are 4 species of hyena alive today: the aardwolf, the spotted hyena, striped hyena, and brown hyena. The brown hyena is the only member not known to live in Kenya, as they are only found in the far south of Africa. The spotted hyena is the largest of the living hyenas, and 150 pounds is a large hyena. However, record specimens have near 200. The spotted hyena is considered the most social carnivore alive today. This is because their groups, or clans, can comprise of up to 80 individuals, with multiple sub-hierarchies and dominant structures. In fact, it has been argued that spotted hyena's social hierarchy is more like that of Old World primate group structure, as opposed to, say, the group structure of a wolf pack. Why is this important? This is important because it's relatively rare to see one spotted hyena, and every report mentioned is of a lone animal. Spotted hyenas are the most common of all hyenas, and they are also the largest. So when District Commissioner Corbett called his creature bigger than a hyena, he already was likely comparing the creature he saw to the largest hyena species. This is what he said, compared to this hyena. Thick reddish-brown hair, with a slight streak of white down the hindquarters. Rather long from hock to foot. Rather bigger than a hyena, with largish ears. I did not see the head properly. It did seem to be a rather heavily built animal. I'm certain that it was a beast I have never seen before. Even if a person is only familiar with one type of hyena, I maintain that they are all similar enough to be labeled as a hyena. If he saw enough of his creature to compare it to a hyena, he likely should have been able to recognize it if it had been one. Hicks, who was on the train, said that the creature he saw was the height of a lion, though not as long, but much thicker. A very tall hyena is 36 inches at the shoulder, which is shorter than even a short lion. An enormous hyena is 200 pounds, while 250 pounds is considered unhealthily small for any adult lion, male or female. So if the creature he saw was in fact as tall as a lion, but with a more short and thick-set body, then he didn't see any hyena. At least, not one that we know of. He even mentions that, quote, "As I got closer, I saw it wasn't a hyena." He said it had a short neck that sloped down, its shoulder blades rose high above the head and rear, and it had a short pugged nose. It was tawny in color. It had shaggy long hair like the mane of a lion, but all over. He said the feet were large. He said the rear was markedly bigger than the front, and it had short but round ears and no tail. Again, if he can compare it to a hyena, he could likely identify a hyena. It has been suggested that the Nandi Bear may be a misidentified lion, but I don't think you can live in the African bush for too long without having a healthy knowledge of lions, especially coming from Europe, where lions have long been endemic to the culture. Plus, these events took place only a short train ride away from, and 10 years after, the waking nightmare that happened in a little nowhere called Tsavo. Lions were probably hard to keep out of mind, so I don't think the Nandi Bear sightings resulted from lions. You know what this is when you see it. It has even been suggested that people misidentified a less common canid, like the Ethiopian wolf, but a canine is a canine, whether or not it was an Ethiopian wolf, jackal, painted dog, or non-native wolf, or loose Rottweiler, or wandering dingo. All canine are pretty distinguishable as such. If we're to believe that these reports have any merit at all, then I don't think they are a result of a misidentified native animal. The central theme to that claim is that if the witnesses were able to compare the creature to known animals, then they should have been able to identify known animals. But a species of non-native animal may have thrown a proverbial curveball, and perhaps the most fitting animal, based on the descriptions and subsequent name, is the bear. I see no particular reason why a small population of bears couldn't subsist for some small amount of time in East Africa. There may be some biologist out there with an obvious answer to refute that, but I don't see any glaring issues. The only bear known to have lived in Africa in recent times is the Atlas bear, which was confined to the Atlas Mountains to the north. Their decline began when they became valuable to the Romans for their blood sports. They were captured and used to fight other animals, gladiators, and finally as a method of execution. And as happens with all things, the more rare the Atlas bear became, the more valuable it became, and thus the more it was sought. I've always had an affinity for Greco-Roman culture, but I fear I have to break with the rank and file on this one. I have no problem with gladiator fights. Sometimes it seems better than what we have going on right now, but there's no need to involve the hapless creatures of the natural world. It is generally maintained that the proliferation of gunpowder was the nail in the coffin for the already nearly extinct Atlas bear. Anyway, Agriotherium was known to have lived in Africa. Agriotherium is a genus of giant bears that lived throughout North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Remains of Agriotherium have been found in East Africa and South Africa, making it the only genus of bear known to have made it south of the Sahara Desert. It is not particularly understood why bears didn't take the same hold on Africa that they managed over nearly the rest of the world. For a long time, we thought it was because big cats reigned supreme in Africa, but there was certainly competition in the rest of the range, so now they say climate must have played a role. Either way, there is a consensus that Africa was simply too competitive. Agriotherium was as large, if not larger, than the largest bears alive today, at some 2,000 pounds. Agriotherium had an extremely powerful bite force, as indicated by its stubby snout, though it's not entirely clear to what end. The bear with the most powerful bite force, pound for pound, is the herbivorous giant panda, while the weakest bite force, pound for pound, comes from the super predatory polar bear, which is ironic, but makes sense considering that bamboo is much tougher to crack than a seal, or you or I for that matter. Agriotherium's limbs were too long and body too heavy to do any sprinting, so they probably intimidated predators away from their kill. But scientists also used to say that about predators like the tyrannosaurs, and that's no longer believed to be the case. Like brown bears in North America, Agriotherium's diet was probably varied by what was seasonally available. Anyway, there is really no reason to suggest that Agriotherium persists to this day. The 2,000-pound bear would be anything but hard to spot. Plus, Agriotherium is far too large to account for these sightings. If the source of the described sightings were either an Atlas bear or Agriotherium, I believe the witnesses would have simply said they saw a bear. Not a Nandi bear, but a bear. So if the Nandi bear wasn't a result of a misidentified native species or non-native species, or variation of known non-native species, what's left? There is one hypothesis that I find curious, and that is the Dinopithecus theory. It is known only by a few skull fragments and a handful of teeth. Because only fragments of the creature have been recovered, much remains unknown. But we do know it was the largest type of baboon ever discovered. A conservative average weight of adult males was placed at 100 pounds, though odds are that individuals may have grown much larger, as monkeys, just like people, vary greatly from individual to individual, and our sample size with Dinopithecus is obviously lacking. Like modern baboons, isotopic analysis shows that Dinopithecus was an omnivore, opportunistically stealing or capturing meat, while also eating grass, seeds, and fruit. Though the analysis indicates that Dinopithecus ate more fruit than baboons today. They are often compared to the living chacma baboon, because the chacma baboon is large, at an average of 70 pounds. One distinction we know of from Dinopithecus's reconstructed skull is that they lack the maxillary ridges, or the concave depressions and bone lines running down the snout of the chacma baboon, meaning the snout was likely shorter and broader, which would look rather like a bear. With such a small sample size, we don't really know when Dinopithecus went extinct, but there is consensus that they lived into the Pleistocene, which ended a mere 11,000 years ago. And it's important to keep in mind that 11,000 years is virtually a margin of error as far as speciation is concerned. Again, there are no limbs or body remnants to speak of, but there seems to be a consensus that Dinopithecus would have stood 1.5 meters tall, with a conservative average for males to weigh around 100 pounds. But that seems a little too conservative for me, actually. You really probably wouldn't have wanted to encounter a troop of these guys on some ancient grassland, with little more than sticks and rocks for defense. But say a remnant population existed. Why would Europeans living in Africa call this a bear? Well, they called this a hairy ant bear, even though it's neither a bear nor is it hairy. We don't really know Dinopithecus's limbs per se, but there is ample reason to suggest that its stature would have been markedly more robust than living baboons today. Though obviously they are not closely related to gorillas, relatively speaking, but there is still reason to suggest that their arms and legs would have been more robust, giving Dinopithecus a more distinctly quadrupedal look. But does Dinopithecus match any of the reports? As for the British Major, no, not really. We don't technically know that Dinopithecus had a tail, but seeing as the skull is so similar to modern baboons, it likely did. As for the travelers whose dogs chased something into the woods, perhaps this could look like a little thick-set bear. It certainly would intimidate dogs, with moaning, peculiar cries. Again, this description is next to useless. A little bear could be 30 pounds, or a little bear could be 200 pounds. As for Corbett's sighting by the river, it actually does fit to an extent. Thick reddish-brown hair is certainly possible. A quote, slight streak of white down the hindquarters, is actually common for a mature gorilla or chimpanzee. I don't think it's a known trait of baboons, but it's still a very primate-ish feature. He said it was rather long from hock to foot, rather bigger than a hyena. In weight, Dinopithecus wasn't too different from modern hyenas, but Dinopithecus likely would have appeared even larger than it actually was, due to longer limbs, less compact bodies, and voluminous hair. Corbett said it had largish ears. Well, some baboons today have no visible ear structure, and some do, but none have largish ears, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Dinopithecus didn't have large ears. He said, quote, it did seem to be a rather heavily built animal, which I think applies, and he said that he was, quote, certain that it was a beast I have never seen before, which would certainly be the case. Dinopithecus ingens literally means giant, terrible ape. As for Hicks's sighting, he said it was the height of a lion, though not as long, which fits. He said it had a short neck and head that sloped down, and that its shoulder blades rose high above the head and rear, which actually seems to check out. He said it had a short, pugged nose, which Dinopithecus had, compared to other baboons, it seems. He said it was tawny in color. It had shaggy long hair, like the mane of a lion, but all over. He said the feet were large. Sure. He said the rear was markedly bigger than the front, which does not apply. He said it moved its front legs at the same time, and then its back legs, which does apply. He said it had short but round ears, which may fit. And he said it had no tail, which most likely doesn't fit. The young boy that Hicks spoke with said the creature he saw looked like a picture of a bear from a picture book, as opposed to any animals sketched in an African fauna field guide. Would Dinopithecus have looked like an illustrated bear? Then there was the Kenyan trader, who saw it reared up on 2 legs looking at him, which certainly could apply. What we know as Dinopithecus can partially account for the descriptions of the Nandi Bear, but it would be more suited if Dinopithecus was actually different from a scaled-up baboon, perhaps a bulkier frame, a greater slope to the neck, no tail, and ears would help, which of course isn't particularly likely but not outright impossible. One piece of supporting evidence to the giant baboon theory is of course the German missionaries who found a village abandoned because of a giant baboon. And make no mistake, An aggressive group of these things would be more than enough to make you reconsider where you want to call home. Even at the weight of a small dog, baboons are brazen, and more than a nuisance. A whole troop of nearly man-sized baboons is kind of hard to imagine. But then, of course, the question must be asked, if Dinopithecus lived 10,000 years beyond when they are thought to have gone extinct, why are they so cryptic? If baboons today are loud, noisy, aggressive, and brazen, why would Dinopithecus be shy and fleeting? In order to answer that question, another candidate for the Nandi Bear must be mentioned, and that is the genus Theropithecus, which is a baboon-like monkey, but not a baboon. Today, Theropithecus is represented only by the gelada, but they were once prolific. There is only a small population of gelada living just north of Kenya, in Ethiopia. It has been argued that gelada have the most complex vocal structures of all non-human primates. How's this for, quote, moaning peculiar cries? According to Current Anthropology 1981, which is a bit ironic, a mass grave of giant geladas known as Theropithecus oswaldi were found in the midst of human artifacts. Remains of dozens, if not hundreds of bodies of Theropithecus were found in a space of only 50 feet. The carcasses were deposited there about 500,000 years ago. Due to the artifacts recovered from the site, it is believed that Homo erectus was responsible for this. It is unknown whether or not the bodies were deposited in the grave at the same time or over a period of years. Either way, geladas are social and intelligent, and hunting them, or even trapping them, would not have been a particularly easy task for Homo erectus. And though the remains indicate that they were butchered for food, it has been speculated that perhaps they were hunted due to competition of plant food resources. And it is very likely that humans in Africa treated Dinopithecus the same way. If a troop of 90 of these laid claim to a fruit orchard, that would very much result in a legitimate intraspecies war. So perhaps Dinopithecus retreated to out-of-the-way places, to avoid conflict with the human populations that usurped the fertile landscapes of the globe. The gelada of Ethiopia have been documented not flinching or fleeing or cowing from Ethiopian wolves, and yet they sprint into the mountains at the first sight of domesticated dogs. They're smart enough to know threats. Perhaps by necessity of survival, Dinopithecus or Theropithecus stayed clear of humans to avoid slaughter, only to be spotted occasionally as the Nandi Bear. So I want to reiterate the primate angle for the Nandi Bear. Mr. Hobley recorded sightings by Europeans of something they couldn't quite identify, something that shares some features with robust and allegedly extinct primates. If they saw a baboon or gelada-like creature, then why did they call it a bear? They called this a bear too. Mr. Huntingford told us about the Nandi's belief in the chemoist, which they believe to be a, quote, gorilla-sized monkey that scalps people. We have the district officer, Mr. Cumberpatch, who described a village abandoned due to what the Pocomo called a man-sized baboon, known for its aggression. And we know that very nearby, man-sized, gelada-like primates known as Theropithecus were slaughtered by the hundreds merely 500,000 years ago. And their only living relatives today, the geladas, flee from dogs, but not from wolves. Could there be yet an undiscovered or uncatalogued species of primate, be it baboon or gelada, who persisted not millions, but certainly thousands of years beyond their alleged expiration dates? It seems unlikely, but I do find it curious how, just as in North America, distinct and separate indigenous cultures have different names for the same thing: a large primate. Anyway, I want to take a moment to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. I can't believe it's already been over a year since I uploaded there. How fast these crazy times have gone. Patreon has more or less become my illustration budget, which is one of my primary limiting factors to production. So I can't express my gratitude to those of you who support me over there. But in a futile attempt to say thank you, I just uploaded a video to Patreon. It's my effort to cover the comprehensive primate fossil record and then discuss the great many mysteries within, because it poses questions to which there are no acceptable answers, in my opinion. It's about 40 minutes long. I started and abandoned the video years ago, because it's an awful lot, but I think it turned into something kind of special, even though it's a little bit more ranty than usual. But if you like this channel and want to help keep it alive and the topic of fossil primate mysteries and what they mean for the likelihood of a North American cryptid sounds appealing to you, then I encourage you to check out my content on Patreon. Anyway, again, make sure you like the video and make sure you're subscribed. And as always, thanks an awful lot for listening. And hey, be good to each other.